Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the American Scouser Fantasy Soccer Show. So, we're going to be going through a few different topics today, primarily talking around building of squads, kind of the strategy around it, things we've learned in our history and experience, which is basically probably how not to do it. But at the same time, we are going to talk that through while also bringing in our first guest submission. So, one of our listeners and avid followers at American Scouser and a helpful contributor to our podcast. By helpful, I mean he annoys me and Paul every week with trivia. Um, BJ Old Fart Soccer Newbie, I didn't make up that name, he gave it to himself, is going to join us in a little bit and he's going to let us take a look at his first draft. And when we say first draft, we're not talking about the first one he put together for this season. We're talking about the first one he's ever put together. So we're going to be kind, with a little bit of cynical eye, probably on that rule, right? as we look over it.
You hit it with a nice comment, really awful criticism, and then a nice comment, and just pack the sandwich together.
Fair way to balance that out. Well played, Mateusz. Before we get into our first topic of building out the squads, we wanted to remind everyone that the American Scouser team is supporting and running the American Scouser Cup. It will be a private league run with traditional scoring. You can join the league by doing the manual option to join new private league and enter the code that you see on the screen here. We're also going to start posting the link in the description of this show in future episodes, and we would love to have you get involved and get your feedback as time goes on. So please join that league, and who knows, maybe you too could win one of these fabulous American Scouser shirts. So we're going to start here, Mateusz, where everyone starts.
Yep.
In building a roster. And there are so many different ways that fantasy managers go about building rosters. When I started, I took the 3 or 4 names that I knew, I took the high value players, and I just kind of rounded it out with players that I didn't really know. And as time went on, I started to spread the money, to different areas of the pitch. And that wasn't very smart either. So I've basically learned not to go the popular route and not to go the balanced average route. It's got to be a good flow of players, from the top end to the bottom end. So when you're first starting your draft, what are some of the key components that you go through?
So this is through the lens of someone who's just been doing this for about 3 years now. With my introduction to fantasy, the first thing I do is I immediately make sure that Mo Salah and Trent are in my teams. Because Mo Salah is the best fantasy Premier League player ever. Just even statistically, you look back the last couple decades or so, if you look at all the numbers, he is the best fantasy player out of any player that's ever played in the Premier League. And Trent is the most undervalued fantasy Premier League player as well at 7.5 million. So, or sorry, is he at 8.5 this year? I think he's still at 7.5.
No, he's still 7.5. He's still way underpriced.
Yeah, considering he was the 3rd highest scorer in all of fantasy last year at 7.5 million, it is a ridiculous bargain. And so that's where I start. Is I know I go with Mo and I go with Trent, and then that I kind of think about. I leave that 3rd Liverpool player kind of in my pocket to think where I could possibly fit him. Because I'm thinking to myself, within the structure of my team, I'm going to try and focus on the top 6, right? There are good players outside of the top 6. There absolutely are. But as far as consistent points, as far as quality goes, I try and hover in that top 6 range. And I'm talking Manchester City. I'm talking Liverpool. We've got Chelsea, Tottenham, Arsenal. And then you kind of like last year was a bit weird, because you didn't really have Manchester United they weren't playing that well. Leicester was falling off as well. And so that last top 6 team was kind of, hit or miss for a little bit. So ultimately each year I kind of just start with the strongest teams in my opinion, and kind of find the best value in each of those teams to put on my team. And then I kind of go from there, and I'll fill out the rest of my team with players outside of the top 6, because there are plenty of players that will get you good points. Like James Maddison last year got fantasy managers a ton of points, even though Leicester didn't play that well last year at all. But I think he was top 10 in the whole league, and just that 8 million, I think it was a good deal there. So that's kind of how I initially attack it from the past couple of years that I've been doing this.
Sure. And I think we should, point out to some of our listeners, and as we've talked about, you could be newer to this game. You could be playing it for, your seventh, eighth season in a row, like I am, or it could be your first time, like we're going to look at with BJ in a little bit. The basic fundamental rule to the game is you need to fill 15 players and you have $100 million salary or budget. There are some rules, right? You have to have 5 defenders, 5 midfielders, 3 forwards, and 2 keepers. And I think it's also important to know the rules around the lineups that you're allowed to start, because it has something to do with when you're filling out your bench. Because I think there is something to having an idea of what the ideal formation is for your side if all of your fit and firing players are playing. So, the rule states you're only starting 1 keeper, obviously. So 1 will be on the bench. And you can have up to 5 defenders. You can have up to 5 midfielders. But there's always a requirement to have at least 3 starting defenders and at least 1 attacking striker or forward. And, last year that became problematic at times because the forwards were so down in fantasy sports and fantasy soccer last year. The scoring really didn't make it worthwhile to have 2 high-priced forwards in most teams. Not only do they score less points for goals than a midfielder or a defender, they don't have the extra added bonus of having the clean sheet points. And oftentimes, even on the bonus scales, they will not get as many points for things like tackles and duels won. And these are things that can honestly swing those, key bonus points. Because really the bonus points, along with picking the right captains, can really be the difference at the end of a campaign. I think it was 2 years ago, I calculated if I had picked the right guy to be captain every week, as in the guy on my team that scored the most points that week, I would have finished 155,000 places higher just by making that switch. And I probably captained Salah 28 times, and it was a good decision. Yeah. So that 150,000 was like 10 outliers because I captained Salah the other 10 times too. Because I, like you, I usually start with Mo. I won't lie. The way they've priced the game this year, I feel like they've priced a lot of players in different ways because they're almost trying to entice managers not to have Mo Salah.
Yeah.
You mentioned how he's the highest scoring player of all time in the history of the game. It's totally true. I think he has 3 of the top 5 scores in the history of the Premier League game. The issue is as his price continues to go higher, you have to build in that value, because when he has a blank, you've invested 13% of your team, and gosh forbid you make the mistake of transferring him out for a week or 2, and then you got to buy him back and pay an extra $500,000 because his prices rose so much because of his expected ownership being so high. So, we talk a little bit about the budget. For me personally, I've changed my mentality and mindset. I used to start with players, and now I actually chart out price points. So I kind of give myself a budget. Right now, I'm sitting at 9 million in keepers, 29 in defense, about 36.5 in the midfield, and very high for me, 25.5 on the striker side. There's a couple strikers out there that I just think are must-haves to start the campaign. Anyone who's watching the preseason probably knows one of them. He's bagging goals left, right, and center, and he's on a new team, and those players usually show up with a mindset. Mateusz and I will show our squads next week. There's no guarantee my squad will even have a single player other than Mo and Trent probably by actual kickoff on Friday, but that's what I do. And then, of course, the team that I show will outscore the team that I start by a good 30 to 40 points.
You've got to have more faith in yourself, man. This is the year.
This is the year. This is the year I finish second in my house, and the dog will probably win. So when you look at this, we talked a little bit about it last week, Mateusz, how this is almost a free wild card. It's almost your first wild card. You have unlimited transfers and you have the
Mhm.
ability to stack your team. How much do you take into account fixtures and the players that you're picking up's extended run of fixtures, almost to proactively avoid those annoying transfers and possible early season hits to the
Yeah.
score?
So ultimately, because I've kind of been trying to change my mindset, I initially started out in my first 2 years like I'm looking at the entire year's worth of fixtures, right? And I had maybe 2 points during the year where I was going to say this is where I'm making my subs to this player, and I'm kind of going to keep that. And so I think this year, what I really want to focus on is not looking so far ahead, especially with that extra boost this year with the World Cup, where you have essentially that extra wild card. So I'm thinking you cut the first half of the season in half, right? So I'm looking at the first 8 game weeks for team one, so to speak, and then at that moment, I will probably use my wild card in between 7 to 9 game week, depending on how everything's going, to then have that team for the rest of the first half of the season. And then have that for the last, whether it's 9, 8, or 7 game weeks that are remaining, and then looking at schedules and fixtures for the second half then, and not worrying about it right now. So right now I'm just looking at the first 6 game weeks for everyone and kind of figuring out from there, having that wild card in the center in the middle of the first half, to take me to the World Cup. And then during the World Cup, like you mentioned last week, and we all know, we have unlimited range to do whatever and overthink everything. And so I think that's going to be another fun way to look at it. But definitely going to try to avoid to look past fixtures that are 6, 7, 8 weeks in the future, because it's so hard to predict next week, let alone 8 weeks from now. So
Yeah, I'm going to try my hardest to not pull a Real Madrid and overanalyze the World Cup and end up walking away from it with James Rodriguez at way too much money. That might be one of the worst World Cup signings of all time. I mean, he did light up the world for a summer and then showed up to Madrid and basically just gained weight and got frosted tips. And next thing you know, he was playing at Bayern. Well, that kind of happened to Coutinho when he went to Barcelona. What's it about these guys going to Spain, getting bad haircuts, and then finding their way to Germany? But we digress. Back to fantasy football. So I've built my team this year stacked on defense. Um, I've monitored, this has been something I've been doing for a few years now, really utilizing defenders. Attack minded defenders just have such an opportunity to score. We've already talked about Trent, and there's others like Chilwell and James. There's great attack minded players like Cancelo, but there's also some diamonds out there, 4.5, 4 million, wing backs that are going to play in systems pressing forward. Do you know the formation that you'll be starting come week one, whether it's going to be 4 defenders, 3 defenders? Have you got that far yet?
that is a great question. In my current draft right now, and I've got it up right here because I'm just going to take a look at it and see what I have going on right now. I have 3 defenders, and I don't think I'm going to stick with that, because I do, after looking through everything and taking another look, I do find a lot more value in the defense that I currently don't have. I feel like I undersold my defense a little bit and invested a little more in going a direction that I haven't gone before, which is 3 premier attacking options, all above 12 million. So typically, I don't do that. But I was looking at some of these players and just some of the fixtures in the opening weeks and just thinking about how it made sense. But now that I'm looking at it and seeing the possible value in defense, I'll probably be tinkering with it. But there are so many great defensive options in that $4 to $5 million range that I would feel comfortable having 3 or 4 of those guys, and then having Trent also. It kind of goes against what I just said earlier about looking at the top 6, because most of the guys are outside of the top 6. But I was just looking at, again, I mean, this is going to be a year of just contradictions probably for me, as I look over and see what I'm doing and then seeing what I'm trying to do. But it'll be exciting to see what happens. But I think ultimately, yeah, I'm going to be tinkering with that defense, because there is some value to be had. Like you said, some diamonds, some cheaper diamonds that you can definitely find.
Yeah, and when I was looking through my team and looking through the players, I recognize one specific price point as very important to have, and that was the $8 million midfielder.
Hmm.
And I had a few different drafts, and I was coming up with 6.5, 7.5, 7 million remaining, and every time it was just I knew what that meant. At some point, I'm going to want Luis Diaz or Mason Mount. At some point, Saka is going to be the player to grab,
Hmm.
or Mahrez. I mean, there's so many quality. Madison, you mentioned him earlier. There's so many quality midfielders in the $8 million range that not having one kind of hamstrings you to either have to dump a Sterling at 10 million or make two transfers to make one move.
Right.
And if I've learned anything in my time playing this game, is the great players, and there are some that are really, really good and understand this game and play it way too thoroughly. And let's be honest, they probably live in their mom's basements and probably watch YouTube shows about fantasy soccer online. So we appreciate all of you, but they genuinely are the folks that never take free hits. And the people who just make three transfers in a week and take a minus eight will drop you 50,000 points in the standings. And people say, well, what's 50,000? Well, it's the difference from finishing 125 to 75. And today, if you're in the top 100,000 of this game, you're in like the top 3% of the world.
Hmm.
I mean, it's a really, really hard thing to do. And I think that's the goal for everyone, really. It used to be top 10, top 10,000. That was the goal. And then that altered to top 100,000 when the game went from 3.5 million to 9.5 million. And they're expecting over 10 million players to play worldwide this year, which is
Wow.
absolutely amazing and ridiculous. And one more reason that the game takes an hour and a half to load on the first day of the season, because everyone's refreshing, trying to figure out all the people in their mini leagues and
Right.
how many people also have Trent, Mo, and Holland. So I'll guess that you have yourself quite a squad, probably somewhere with a Mo, a Holland or a Kane, maybe a Son or a De Bruyne. There's only so many players over 12. And
I
that'll be really nice to have those three. I'll be
Yeah.
interested to see how you fill out the remainder, because it's not easy when you have, as they call it, the threemium.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull that. I've tried to come up with some drafts. I end up with too many 4.5s, 4s, and 5s for my liking. And that balance scoring, I think, really does hurt. And the other problem I have with it is if you get too much on the template, if the template takes off, you're doing well, but so is everyone else in the game.
Correct. Correct.
And at some point, you got to have those differentials. And we will get in as the season goes on. Each week, we're going to try to have a segment on a strategy or a topic, not just the players. But starting next week, we will start talking about enablers, folks who fill rosters, the players we have on our kind of watch list, and the players that are must starts for week one. So we will start to get into our specifics. But we were lucky enough to have a team sent in to us by one of our very own contributors. So we would like to welcome in. As I said, I did not give him the name.
I'm proud
BJ,
of it.
Old Fart Soccer Newbie. He is proud of it. Any listeners that happen to listen to SiriusXM, you probably hear some of BJ's tweets read on the football show, occasionally on Grumpy Pundits. I always find it funny when I'm listening and I hear it. Because they almost apologize like I did when they say his name. And then immediately I send him a message, which usually lets him tell me that he wasn't listening, but he'll go find it on the app. BJ, how are you doing tonight? And how is everything going down in Florida?
Doing good, gentlemen. Nice to see you all.
It's
All
great
I'm
to see
asking,
you too.
be kind. This is,
Oh,
like the word soccer newbie there has a meaning. I've been a Liverpool supporter thanks to a mixture of the Lusitania and East Europe revolutions and Bill Shankly retiring. I've been a Liverpool supporter since 1974, but I didn't give a hoot about association football until about 5 years ago. So I
Okay.
am truly a newbie here. And this is my first time trying fantasy at this level. I did no foot league fantasy for a bit. This is brand new territory for me. So
Well,
Forgive
it's
me.
a different game, and you'll have some questions. You can feel free to ask us as we go.
Yeah, I
We're
had
gonna
no idea
take
how the
it.
points work. So
We're gonna take it easy on you. We'll talk a little bit about the scoring, and I think that's probably something you do want to read up on. When you go into the game, if you click up under the help, they have a
Mhm.
really nice frequently asked questions. It takes you through the rules around transfers, the rules around scoring, what points you get. But let's jump into it and take a look at your team.
Okay.
So uh, let's start here with the keepers and the defense. I There's not going to be an argument from me on starting Allison or picking up Allison. Premium goalkeepers isn't always the way folks go because it invests a lot of money in a place where oftentimes scores are very similar between a 4.5, a 5, and a 5.5. I
Mhm.
will say there have been times where goalies have been 6, 6.5. They've really brought them down. And I think that was to try to get, again, less people being able to have Salah and Holland in their sides.
Yep.
Mateusz, when you first take a look at this and you look at the defense and the keepers, what's the first thought that comes to your mind?
First thought that comes to mind is it's a little weak at the back considering the club level compared to the rest of the league, right? So Matty Cash, in his own right, I have to love him because he's Polish now. He's great. Connor Cody's great. Tyrone Mings is great. Gabrielle is great. They're all great in their own right. But as a whole, collectively, defensively, their teams aren't always. Wolves last year, they had a pretty good defensive record. But Aston Villa didn't have a great defensive record. And Arsenal, you kind of don't know what you still get with them. There were moments last year where we thought that they were going to be relegated, kind of, but not really. And then there were moments where they looked like one of the best clubs in the league. And so I think based on the amount that each of those defenders cost, I think there are better options to look at if you want someone at that price point, to kind of look towards the bigger clubs, because the bigger clubs, not all our defenders are premiumly priced, right? So you don't have, not everyone's a Trent at 7.5. So you have a good mixture of defenders with different amounts across each team. I'd say maybe I say this and then I look at my team and I'm like, okay. So I'd say, be confident in 2 to 3 of your defenders that play on a very good defensive back line that has a decent keeper behind them. And granted, Aston Villa, you have Martinez back there, so they can be good defensively. I just feel like it's kind of too much of a risk to take based on the money that you're spending back there. And then as far as goalkeepers are concerned, you only get one to play. So don't invest more money in your backup keeper. You can definitely take $1 million down from Mendy and invest that maybe into the defense instead, because that bench goalie is never going to play. And if Ali gets hurt, then you have the 5.5 for the keeper that you can sub out for a different, let's say a Ramsdale at 5, or or an Ederson at 5.5 if you want to keep that premium goalie. So just you get an extra $1 million if you bump down Mendy, because he's not going to play. So.
And the other thing I was thinking too, and I was looking through it a little more, is that of the 5 defenders, 4 of them come from 2 teams, Aston Villa and Wolverhampton. And if there's scheduling problems or stuff like that, I could really be, up,
Yeah,
up the spit without a paddle. So I was thinking of possibly realigning just for that reason. I do want to keep Cash, and I think I do want to keep Cody, but the others, there's some room I think there to adjust a bit.
Yeah, and that was what my comment about the defense would be. One, you have 2 players on 2 different sides, and I am just gonna go out there in a positive and say that we don't have the scheduling nightmares that we've had in the last couple seasons due to COVID. I'm hoping that we're at a point now where matches aren't canceled for those types of
Knock
things.
on wood. Yeah.
That being said, a single goal gets scored against either of those teams, and those defenders' possibility of 6 points go to 2 really fast.
Mm-hmm.
2 goals get scored, they get 1 point, and before you know it, you have 2 guys, maybe 4 guys even, not bringing in any points. So the other thing is you really want to, unless you have a really strong goal scoring threat on a great team as a center back, you really oftentimes want to avoid the center backs because the clean sheet is great, but they offer very little attacking returns going forward. The outlier to that, right? Van Dijk scores goals. At the end of last year, Kanate was scoring goals. Rudiger was, I think, the highest scoring defender, center back in the Premier League last year because he was scoring goals. He was basically Chelsea's entire focal point on set pieces. So there's something to look at with that. You have that in Mings, yet I question in the long run whether Mings may find himself out of the starting lineup now that they have Diego Carlos. We'll see what Gerrard ends up doing. I think Kanza is a better defender in my opinion. The one that I really do like Gabriel. Gabriel has become a leader of the Arsenal team. Arsenal has really good fixtures early in this campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So I like the Gabriel pick by you. I could do with cash. I think you should look into thinking more about the Cody, Mings, Kilmans of the world, because I think for those same price points, you can find fullbacks that offer the same amount of opportunity to score points on defense while also giving you options to attack, whether that's James Justin, there's Altonori. Like you have two Wolves players, and in my opinion, you don't have their best defender. So just as an example of ideas to look at. But all in all, pretty good. I'm going to agree here with Mateusz regarding the keepers. You got to pick one of them because they're both quality starts from the jump. You got to pick one keeper. And I'll say this. I'm a big fan of finding a keeper that is set it and forget it for as long as possible. I don't like wasting transfers on keepers. And people say to me, well, what do? You get a $4.5 million keeper and he's not any good. Odds are he'll get 8 to 10 less points than the high level keepers. The other nice thing is if you pick up a keeper on, say, Brighton, and they have a nice run of form and you pick up Sanchez, you can pick up the backup goalie for Brighton for $4 million and only spend $8.5 million on your two goalies. And in a worst case, you'll wake up that morning and you look at the lineup and Sanchez isn't playing. Instead of going, my goalie's not playing today, the backup keeper is already on your team and getting auto subbed in. So there's an auto sub policy as well that you'll learn as you kind of play the game a little bit. So it's not just about who's in your starting lineup, but mitigating against the issues should one of them not play. Okay. But let's jump over the midfield and let's move to the front line. It's an interesting one with Darwin, Vardy, and Brian Mbeumo on your bench. I was a big fan of Mbeumo last year as a midfielder. Started him. He scored a couple goals early, made me look brilliant, and then made me look stupid. Like most things that happen in fantasy, it made me look dumb. So I do like that pickup, but he's a little bit less value now that he's a forward. Little less points for goals, no more clean sheets. I'm a little nervous on Darwin because I'm not sure he's going to play all that much at the beginning, and I'm not sure he's going to start. There's part of me that feels like we're all saying this, and then he's going to go out there against Fulham and score 2 goals and start every match after it. But I do like the Vardy party as long as he's healthy, though I will say Leicester has a really, really tough run of fixtures to start the season. So though I like the talent of your front three, I don't know if it's the right time to start these players. Okay. Mateusz, what are you thinking looking at that front three?
Yeah, I think part of it is based off of what you invested in your midfield, right, with Salah and Son. So you're trying to find the best value at that moment there with Darwin and Vardy and Mbeumo. And for me, I think I'm really worried about Vardy's production this year. I don't think you're going to get enough of him to warrant the price that he's at now. I think that you're going to get better value out of someone like Iheanacho. I know that I feel like that's been said for a while now. But then you also have someone like Patson Daka who you can put in and not spend the 9.5 on Vardy. So I just think at this point in his career, he might be a little bit overpriced for what he is producing. I like him as a player. I've loved him as a player, but I think there's better value to be had if you want to spend that 9.5 on that player specifically. Because then I'm looking at someone like potentially like Ivan Toney. If he has an okay year this year, he's $2.5 million less. He outscored Vardy last year. And so that's $2.5 million, and then you can use elsewhere potentially as well. Same concerns echoed about Darwin for me is we don't quite know how he's going to start. We don't know if it's going to be a slow start. We don't know if it's going to be where he's going to be sitting with that.
That's an emotional pick. I'll totally,
and that's fair.
confess to that. Yeah,
that's absolutely fair. I know. Go ahead.
No, but that's one of the things. People just jump in. I mean, there are times there are just players you love. You know, I haven't seen Paul's team yet, but I'm pretty sure Jared Bowen's in there. Whether or not, he's worth $8.5 million. I just know that from the time he finally realized he was better than the guy he argued with me about all summer that was not good enough for Liverpool, and then was like, damn, we should have signed that player last summer. He put him on his fantasy team like usual. Paul complains about something and then goes ahead and just bangs it out. And you're like, go to play him that week. And you're like, wait, he talked all week about how this guy stinks. And now he's playing me heads up with this guy.
Well, it's
for me, I think Mateusz's point is spot on. Actually, I would find $500,000 or $1.5 million, whatever the difference is. I think it's $1 million. I would find that million somewhere here, and I would upgrade Mbeumo to Tony. I think if you like the idea of having a Brentford striker, and they have great fixtures out of the gate, you might as well have the number one guy that scores the goals and takes the penalties. Knowing who's on set pieces, knowing who's on corners, knowing who's on penalties, these are also big advantages. I jokingly kind of poked fun at your Declan Rice earlier, right, when we were talking. But at least you know that if West Ham gets a penalty, Declan Rice is going to step up and hopefully slot it for 5 points for you. Mm-hmm. And those are pieces that are important to have. As far as your forward line goes, I think you should spread the money a little bit more. If you're going to spend $18.5 million on 2 strikers, you're only $1 million away there from having Haaland and Jesus.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's going to be my point.
So
and if I save $1 million from dropping Mendy, and that's $1 million there.
Exactly. And maybe reshifting some of that money around. Mm-hmm. So let's move to what I feel is by far your strongest segment of the squad, which is the midfield. And let's just pass, right? We're not going to talk about Mo Salah. We all know why he's on your side. He is the best player. He's the best fantasy player while also being the best player on your favorite side. Mm-hmm. It's easy to watch. It's easy to root. It's easy to have him on your team. It's easy to put that C on him and never change it. So we'll leave that one there and kind of put it on the side. Mateusz, what are your thoughts? Specifically, let's stick with Rice and Son.
So I like the Son pick. I had him at the end of last year, and that was a great period to have him. It was one of those moves where I felt like I ended up dropping Mo and going with Son, and it felt like that was the best time to do it, and it worked out for me. So I like the Son pick. I'm kind of basing this off of what I've been trying to how to do my team as well. And I mean, I have Kane right now instead of Son, but there is a chance that I might swap those two and do Son instead of Kane, just because they have a great. I mean, it's not or maybe not a great. They've had a pretty decent start to the year, right? They've looking over. They've got Southampton at home, Chelsea away, Wolves at home, Nottingham Forest away, West Ham away, and then Fulham. So all in all, looking for some good returns there. So Son, I like the pick. I think with Rice, and I personally have a couple midfielders that I really like for that same amount that I think you can get a little bit more value for. So someone like maybe Leon Bailey or someone like De Silva are kind of 2 guys in that $4.5 to $5 million range that I really like. That because with Rice, you kind of he's a fantastic box-to-box midfielder, but he's not a fantastic fantasy midfielder. There's a difference between a great player and being a great fantasy player. Mm. You have, like, if you think about this in any other sport, like football or basketball, those guys that get you those numbers, but they're not great. Whereas you have the best team players that have played the game, but they're not going to get you the fantasy numbers. So from that aspect, I think there's a little bit more you can have with in that regard. With Odegaard, I like the Odegaard pick. I think for 6.5, it's not too bad. I think there are a few guys less than 6.5 that I might replace Odegaard with. So if you happen, what I would maybe look at doing is possibly really decide what you want to do with your forwards. If you want to kind of reinvest the money there and then maybe put a couple million more towards the midfield and upgrade one of Rice or Odegaard to get that $8 million midfielder that Gally mentioned earlier before you came on, because that's where I'm at too. Is I have that $8 million midfielder because that gives you the flexibility for any sort of transfers that you need to make. Because right now you're either at 12 million or you're at 6.5. There's a huge gap between your premier midfielder and your next level, and you need someone in between that 6.5 to 12 to be there as a kind of a buffer in case you need to make any transfers in that midfield.
Okay. That's definitely parts I don't know about the game, so that helps.
Yeah, and that's why we're doing this. We want to help you, and we're hoping that other viewers and listeners will be able to be helped by it as well. And oh no, what the hell do we know? We're probably going to finish like 80th and 81st out of the damn league at this point. That's what happens as soon as we start doing this damn thing. We're like, we start a show, and you'll just watch. It'll just be like. But when you're looking at things like an example, though, is like Billy Gilmore, right? If Billy Gilmore was out on loan somewhere, it would make total sense to have him as bench fodder. He's going to get minutes. He has some talent. Having Chelsea's 8th midfielder at 4.5 on your bench, there are 4.5 midfielders that might play. That might even just play two, get you 2 points because they get 60 minutes of run out or occasionally get to the match. So for me, you don't need a bench that are going to be world beaters, but they should at least be players that regularly get minutes. Because if one of your starters doesn't start or gets sick or isn't playing or is suspended, it's annoying enough when you find out that, Vardy's being rested. But it's even worse when you have 3 guys on your bench that don't get a minute on the pitch either. And you don't have that opportunity, because the way this game works is the system at the end of the week will make 3 substitutions for you if players that you have starting score 0 points and play 0 minutes in a match. So the order of your bench is important too. Like, you wouldn't want Mbeumo behind Kilman and Gilmore, because Mbeumo is probably going to start and could score. And if you did have a guy not play, you'd want that to be the first guy coming off your bench. And the auto substitution comes in the order, which is why you have a 1, a 2, a 3.
Okay, so I had no idea about that. Okay, cool.
All this stuff is things that you'll learn as you play, as you see things happen. You'll be like, wait, my score was 82 and now it's 87. Well, you had a 5-point person on your bench that got auto substituted in for one of your players who didn't start.
Okay.
So keep that in mind when you're picking your team. Keep that in mind. I actually like the basis of your team. I do think if you're going to invest as much as you are in strikers, like, you have a team that isn't that far away from having 3 premium assets and a few really strong pieces. But I think if you're going to do that, you're going to have to clean up a little bit some of the doubles, the double Wolves, double Villa in defense.
Yep.
Too much money spent on your keepers. And then really just looking at guys and saying, hey, if I had one guy on Brentford, which guy do I want? Is it Mbeumo? And that to me is something I had to do. Like, I had to start looking at teams and say, I want an $8 million midfielder. I want flexibility. I know I want a piece of Arsenal attack. I'm going to get Saka. I may really want Luis Diaz because I love Liverpool and I think he's going to have a great year and kick on with goals. But at some point, I've already got Trent and I've already got Mo. And there's only so many points that can come out of one team in a match week, right? Like, that. I used to hear people all the time tell me, I'm going to get Sadio Mane and Salah. And I'd always be like, you banking on 5 goals every week? I know I'd love it, but it probably doesn't always happen. So spreading out the money, spreading out a little bit of the players. And then I think you also got to play around a little bit with the game by reading the rules and looking at some of the drop-down menus in the transfer window. It'll actually show you some neat things, like they rank players on form. You can look at last year's, standings, give you an idea. And the other nice thing is you have to pay attention to the transfers. You have to pay attention to new players coming in, managers, styles. And that's really where I think where the game goes from being like average to really in depth is when you start applying the same type of logic you would if this were your team. Because you start thinking about like, would you want a guy who, if you were picking a guy to score goals, would it be a guy on a team that sets up with a low block like Burnley? You know, I don't know how many times last year I got burnt because Burnley'd have two matches in a game week, and I'd pick up one of their cheap players thinking if they get one goal, I'll be the winner. And then some other player would score twice as many points because I've got Weghorst getting twos on double game weeks. And you're like, wow, that's fun. I got 4 points, and Harry Kane scored 4 goals. Yeah. Do you have any questions for us before we let you go and wrap up for the week?
I mean, again, my whole thing this year is that this is going to be like my learner's permit. This is a trial, so I'm not even worried about placement or anything. This is for me to learn about the game. So this is all great advice. The one question, and it kind of comes up to one of the things you talked about early, what I was trying to do was, okay, I want to spend about 10% here. I want to spend about 25% here, 40% here. I'm not quite sure that that's necessarily the right way to go, though, from what you were saying. So in terms of that, is that the way to approach it? In terms of what you're spending per position, or
I mean,
is it better more on the individual player by player level rather than position?
I think it's a mixture, and I'll let you answer a little bit of that too, Mateusz. For me, it's a mixture. You have to know roughly what you want to spend in each area, or it's easy to just get, that buyer's excitement and just buy everything that's shiny in the window, right? Like you just start clicking on stuff.
Like my first try had De Bruyne in there too. I had Salah, Son, and De Bruyne. I mean, it was like, and then I didn't have room for anything else.
Yeah.
So,
and that's what it comes down to. It is a trial and error thing. Pay attention to the money. I think it's a combination. It's having a plan and sticking to it. And I think that's the biggest key is making a plan and sticking to it. Because so many players deviate so quickly, they panic, they hit the wild card button after week 2 because things didn't go their way in 2 weeks, and it's the first international break after the 3rd week, and they're like, I have 2 weeks to make unlimited transfers. And then they find out that the team that they had originally started with would be 40 points higher after week 11 if they had just stuck with their gut. Now, there are times you'll find things that just don't work. And at that point, you do have to, know to move the ship. But how would you respond to that question that BJ had, Mateusz?
Yeah, I think ultimately the wonderful thing about this game is that you have such a personal take on it, right? You can attack it as your own, as however you'd like to attack it, because there are so many different strategies, so many different ways of doing it. It lends itself to open up all sorts of possibilities of however you want to break it down. I don't think having the kind of percentages that you listed for, I don't think that's a bad idea at all, because that gives you a basis of where you want to be at, right? So if you kind of use that as a guide to where you want to be, but don't necessarily feel like you have to be at 10% for this, but be like, let's say you have a plus or minus of 3%. So, you have 7 to 13% of whatever allocated to this position that you want allocated. And then the rest can kind of have a margin of error, so to speak, as well. And so I think it's going to come down to, as you play more, you'll find in yourself patterns that you like to do. And, and then in watching other people talk about this and watching other people's strategies, you might kind of find things that work for you, or you might look at that and go, that doesn't really work for me, but I understand the idea behind it. Because I like what you said before when you were asking, like, do you do percentages or do you look for the actual player versus player value? And I don't think there's anything wrong with the player versus player value. It's just a matter of which 2 players are you comparing, right? Because if I'm comparing Darwin and Vardy to each other, I don't like that comparison because I don't like either one in this position. But then when we're talking about if you're comparing, let's say, Darwin and Vardy to a Haaland and then taking a little bit less to then bring on a Gabriel Jesus, then that also has its own merit as well. So yeah, I think ultimately it's awesome because you get to put your own take on it and how you feel most comfortable doing it. it'll just take a little bit, and you'll get used to it, and you'll have lots of fun, or you get really mad and angry like Timothy, and it's fine.
Yeah, and no matter what, I was gonna say, if we say Jesus' name one more time, a Turkish dictator somewhere in a suburb in Chicago is gonna shudder and curl up into a ball and just get all angry and upset. But I
We
think
can make him
BJ, the
even
number
more
one.
upset. I could show him my baseball scoring card. That'll really,
Oh no!
That'll really get him going. Last thing he needs to
Don't
see
watch
is
this,
that
Timothy.
it's not the fact that you follow baseball, the fact that you're actually keeping score. Which
I've scored
basically,
baseball games for 40-something years now, well, almost 50 years now. So what can
everybody,
I say?
we've been there. Everybody's been there. So BJ, want to thank you for putting in your team. Thank you for joining the league. Thank you for attempting to learn the new sport.
Oh,
We're excited to have you. If you do have questions, feel free to let us know. Feel free to talk some trash when your team is doing better than ours halfway through the season, because you know nothing about it, and that is a surefire means to success.
Yep. And if my team starts doing bad and yours is better, I'm just going to make the trivia questions harder.
Ooh.
That will not surprise me one bit. And well, you know, I'll do my job to ruin the segment as I usually try to, but Paul always goes first, so it's already Schadenfreude and a train wreck anyways.
I know. And
BJ,
I love the look on his face. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thanks, BJ.
Thank you. Have a great night.
You too.
Want to remind everyone once again to please join the American Scouser Cup. It's in the Fantasy Premier League game. It's super simple. You just got to go into your team, click on leagues, join new league, select private, and enter the code on the screen. We'll make sure to share that link in all of our posts and descriptions moving forward for future upcoming Fantasy Premier League shows. And I got to tell you, Mateusz, my favorite part of fantasy sports is probably the banter. So I think between now and next week, we probably have to think of what the quote unquote bet will be for us here on American Scouser TV on the fantasy show. So I need you to think about that between now and next week so we can let the listeners know before the season starts what that bet should be. And it doesn't have to be the same for both of us. So I might have to think about what the bet will be for you, my friend.
You know, I almost wore my old Sacramento Kings Jason Williams jersey as an idea of you possibly thinking it was a Doug Christie jersey just for fun. But I think we can schedule a fun little Chicago Fire outing with you asking for an autograph on one of your jerseys. I think that could be doable.
Oh, I knew it was gonna come. I swear that soundbite will never, ever, ever let me down. It's amazing what happens when you rip on kids. It's never usually a good option, right? But I've learned.
Let's be honest.
I've learned.
I'm gonna get a soundbite.
Make a point and stick to it. Doesn't matter if it's right or not. You just had to have conviction. Well, Mateusz, thanks again for another great show. That's going to wrap up our third edition of the Fantasy Premier League show brought to you by our good friends here at American Scouser. We'd like to thank our first submission from one of our listeners, BJ Old Fart Soccer Newbie. I didn't make that name up. You saw his name on the screen, people. But before we go, let's just make sure we want everyone to get over there to the YouTube page. Make sure and subscribe, like, comment, share this with your friends. If there's something you'd love to see on the fantasy show moving forward, leave it in the comments or send us a message. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you all next week.